Story 1. At the last minute, the owner, manager, and chief executive officer dictator revoked my Christmas leave. My wife was terminally ill, my daughter was about to move off to college, and it would be our last Christmas together. It was the only time in my life I have ever said, "Forget you," to a boss's face. Story 2. Dumbass were exploding acetylene gas for laughs, and the owner of the company thought it was cool. I quit on the spot. Addendum. The owner of the company was given it by his dad on his 18th birthday, and his dad took the company back after a few months. Story 3. I had a verbal agreement with my manager that she would reduce my hours so I could continue working during the school year. She scheduled me for 40 hours per week on the first school-time schedule. I spoke to her about it and reminded her of her promise. She stonewalled and denied everything. I apologized and walked out of her office. I graduated and got a good job writing software. 30 years later, Kmart no longer exists. Forget you, Beth. Story 4. I was working for a major video game company back in 2003. We were in crunch time, working from 7 a.m. to 2 a.m. 6 days a week. Right before lunch, our supervisor walked in and said, "Good news, everyone. We get to come in on Sundays now, but it's only a half day." The moment he was done with his speech, I walked over to his desk and told him I was quitting immediately. He warned me that I would never work in the game industry again. I didn't give a proper 2 weeks notice. I told him that was fine and finished my day. I ended up working in the industry for another 3 years until I freaked out and quit for good. Never again. Story 5. I was told I wouldn't be getting a raise because I asked for it. But apparently, if I hadn't asked, I would have gotten it. My boss then said I was on the bad list of the higher boss for asking and that I wouldn't get a raise for at least a few months. Yeah, I quit right there. Story 6. Had a supervisor who was really unprofessional and disrespectful. When I turned in my 2 weeks, I also left a personal note for my manager telling them exactly why I was quitting, and that I refused to work any more shifts with the supervisor during my exit period. The first week was fine, but I walked in one day and there was the supervisor. I gave them a chance, but they quickly pulled some nonsense, so I walked out and skipped my remaining shifts. No spectacle, but I'm still proud that I stood up for myself. Story 7. Head mechanic at a small but busy bicycle shop. Been there 5 years or so with no raises other than promised soon. Owner showed up with a nice new car and started the same old spiel about there not being enough money to offer a raise of any sort. Told him to get lost, walked out, and went down to the main competitor down the road. Better pay and a better place to work. Once word got out I was there, a lot of the clientele followed me there. Old place was out of business in 9 months or so. Story 8. I've done it twice. First time, the district manager at Applebee's decided that my request off for a school competition, which I had put in months earlier and had been approved already, was just not going to work anymore and changed the schedule without telling me. I didn't come in because I didn't know. Then, about 2 months later, my mom called in for me because I was projectile vomiting from flu or food poisoning, and he yelled at her. As soon as I could walk without vomiting, I took my uniform in, handed it to him, and left. Second time, I was working at a daycare while looking for work as a teacher. The daycare charged by the hour, so they only got money if the kids were there. They wouldn't call parents if the kids were sick or had fevers. One day, I was left in a room by myself with 9 infants. No break. Not only is that illegal, it is extremely dangerous. I called her after relief showed up and quit. Story 9. I spent a year fixing things and hired a team. The system started generating real profit and loss, and the boss, who had previously messed everything up, began to re-engage as the situation improved, making foolish suggestions and wasting valuable time. We had a meeting where he was talking endlessly, and I remarked that it was counterproductive. He called me after the meeting and asked, "What was that?" I responded that it was becoming unpleasant with the meetings and change of course. He said, "If you don't like it, leave." And I said, "Okay," and walked out. Everyone stood there shocked as I left. Fast forward a year later, and everything was messed up again. Story 10. New in the field on my own in my early 20s, and with no prior experience being up high on ladders. I believe it was my 3rd day out as a cable installation technician. I got to the site and it was a midspan drop, meaning along the wire on the pole midway between poles. Right in the way were trees and bushes, making it nearly impossible for me to get the ladder correctly positioned. I tried for a good while and then called dispatch. They complained about my complaint and basically told me to deal with it and figure it out. So, I tried again, getting the ladder hooked but nearly vertical. I got the best angle I could on it and climbed up a couple of rungs, but the ladder tipped back. A few more repositionings later, and now I have the ladder against a tree, but there are limbs and bushes poking through the rungs. I start to climb, and maybe 4 or 5 rungs up, the whole ladder shifts sideways, and I nearly went tumbling. Called dispatch, and they more or less told me I was to stay there until I had the job done. So instead, I packed everything up, told the customer I couldn't help them, and went back to the warehouse, dropped all the equipment and cable boxes that I had, and left. I didn't even say a word to anyone there. Story 11. I was a floor nurse at the time. My boss promised me that if I worked on Thanksgiving Eve and Thanksgiving Day, Halloween Eve and Halloween Day, and Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, that I could have New Year's Eve and New Year's Day off, my favorite holiday. I agreed and did it, the Halloweens and the Thanksgiving's dates. Out of nowhere, she revoked that promise in the first week of December, saying we all needed to be part of a team and that she couldn't honor that promise and that I was expected to work Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. I didn't quit on the spot, but I gave a week's notice 2 days later that I was leaving. I didn't cover Christmas/Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. Her face was priceless. She was like, "I cannot believe you're doing this to me at a busy time like this." The last thing I heard about her is that a lot of the nurses ended up leaving, and she is no longer a manager. She is a simple floor nurse herself now. She was crazy. She wouldn't even allow us to drink coffee. She took away our coffee maker, saying it's unhygienic to have this in a hospital, not even in the nurse's lounge. Crazy. Story 12. They tried to have me come in and run the store literally as I was coming out of anesthesia from surgery for an injury I got working there. "Hey, I know you just had surgery and are still in post-operative care. I need you to close tonight. You don't have an option." I quit and let an attorney deal with it. Story 13. This job I worked at years ago had a habit of telling people, "Oh, there's no work at the moment. Have a few days off and we'll let you know when to come back." Then just never call people back because they didn't want to have to actually fire the person. They did it to me after a job got messed up when I was following my supervisor's directions. I asked him multiple times, "Are you sure? The thing we don't want will likely happen if we do it." And he kept telling me to proceed. Then when the customer complained, he suddenly blamed it on me. The next day they pulled the "hey, there's no work right now" thing. Except they did actually call me back the next week when they realized nobody else knew how to do my job and they were struggling. I came into my office to find it a mess, and this guy I got along with came in and was surprised to see me there. He told me how management said they let me go and had him doing my job, but he had no idea what to do. I was pretty upset then, so I walked to the office, handed over my high-visibility vest, and walked out. The manager was being really arrogant. Then about 5 minutes later, as I was driving away, she realized they still had nobody who knew how to do my job and started calling me repeatedly. When I wouldn't answer, she started texting me, begging me to call her back to work this out. I left that place and never went back. Also, about 6 months later, that manager was fired. A year after that, the company was bought out. Story 14. I worked for a photographer and we were on a tight deadline schedule. Most of the office had been let go for the summer, so it was just me, the head of my department, one coworker, and the owner. I came in to discover the owner had left town with his family on vacation. I hit my breaking point. I put my letter of resignation on his desk while he was gone. My only coworker left with me. The owner had no idea what had happened until he returned home to the letter, undone work on the counter, and 0 employees. Story 15. I was hired as a manager of a warehouse, my first time being a manager. The first thing I was told was to create structure and to find the 2 most useless people to terminate and replace. To create structure, I quickly discovered that no one had a valid forklift license. All health and safety regulations and occupational safety and health administration requirements were outdated by over 6 years, and none of the forklifts had their annual inspections completed. Additionally, there was no record of anyone doing a daily forklift inspection, which is a requirement at the beginning of each shift or when someone else starts to operate the lift truck. I was also asked to find cheaper suppliers for warehouse-related items. I asked, "What is my budget?" The response was, "There isn't one, just find cheaper options." Identifying 2 employees was not difficult because they only chose to show up when they felt like it. I attempted to terminate them, but my boss wouldn't allow it. Regarding the forklift licenses, he refused to bring in a trainer. He wouldn't permit me to order from any other company. The reason? I have no idea. As for the annual inspections, they were deemed too expensive. Then people started refusing to train me, which I didn't realize until later, but they told my boss they had and claimed I wasn't picking it up. Soon after, the sabotaging of my work began, and orders started getting picked up prematurely, resulting in fines of over $1,000 because they weren't supposed to go out until 3 weeks later. All of this happened over the course of 2 months. I had been unemployed for 6 months between this job and my previous one, where the company went under. I told my girlfriend that I couldn't take it anymore and that the legal repercussions I could face if someone were to get hurt were far too high to risk it. So, I decided to resign the next morning, which she supported. I arrived at work 30 minutes early, grabbed all my belongings, and put them in my car. Then, the person who made my life miserable at that place walked in and started yelling at me in front of all the staff about how I sent an order out 3 weeks early. I reminded her that she forgot she CC'd me on an email where she instructed that customer to pick up the order. I told her to back off. I headed to my boss's office, ready to tell him I was done, but he terminated me first. Ironically, this worked out better for me, as I received unemployment benefits for the next 6 months. As I was leaving, quite upset, I announced to the staff that on my first day, I was told to find 2 of them to terminate, so they should take that as a reflection of how the company values them. Fast forward 8 months later, I finally found a new job and learned that about a week ago at that company, someone fell off a forklift at a higher elevation, broke their pelvis, and they were now facing a massive lawsuit as well as huge fines. Good riddance. Story 16. My manager was intentionally trying to sabotage me and write me up for false things because I challenged her at times. I was the assistant manager. I didn't want to get fired, so I just told her I was done and walked out. Story 17. I already had another job lined up. So, when I got pushback from my district manager about my almost 3-week notice, I just handed over my store keys and left. Story 18. I was denied promotion for the 3rd time in 4 years. Always great performance reviews. Maximum score. An example to others. The first time it was too soon, as I had only been in the company for 10 months. But of those 10, 5 were a complete crisis where management gave up and burned out, and I had to save the data. The second time, the acting manager convinced his buddy to run for promotion as well so he could pick him, but I was made high potential without any benefits, raise, projects, or training. The third time, they didn't even post the job internally. When I asked for a reason, I was called in to the human resources manager, who said, "You stayed at home for 2 weeks in the first COVID lockdown, which showed a lack of commitment." I was working an extra day on overtime for 3 years at that point, at least 20 days a year. I told her I would be taking up all my paid overtime and sending in my resignation at the end of the day, and that I would also be requesting a formal exit conversation with the vice president. He knew me for my first year when I had to save the ship. Things escalated quickly after that. Story 19. My boss had me riding in the same vehicle as someone he knew had a highly infectious illness, and it was our job to go into homes of both infants and elderly people. Story 20. Oh, maybe my favorite ever story to tell, though it's not very dramatic. I used to get mini panic attacks on Thursdays in sort of a, "I can't believe this is what I'm doing with my life" kind of way. And I'd chill out by going to the vending machine or getting a drink of water and remembering the next day was the last of the week. Then one day I started feeling this way hard on a Wednesday. I started adding up all my assets in my head and figuring out how long I could go without a job. I cleaned my workstation, packed up my things, went to the office and said to the supervisor, "I think I have to quit." The night office lady cried and hugged me. I was on 3rd shift and quit in the middle around 2 a.m. or so. I'd been there 8.5 years. The de facto human resources woman, who knew I had been unhappy for a while, put a few extra vacation days on my last paycheck. Story 21. First day on the job at a shop, and they told me to clean the toilets because someone had made a mess on the floor. I was not willing to do that and walked out. It helped that I was a teenager at the time with no responsibility.